Hey, everybody.
Hey.
Good, good. How are you?
Well,
It's a nice mask you're wearing this evening. Thank you. You do it for my safety, right? Thank you. Okay. I'm going to do something tonight that I hadn't really planned on until events of the last 24 hours, and I thought, well, let's do it. So, everybody knows something. There's some things that have happened in the last 24 hours. Yeah. So we're gonna kind of some things happened. Some people did some stuff. So yeah, you can tell who the people who read stuff. Yeah, that is, yeah. So anyway, I thought it'd be kind of interesting because if you're kind of a watcher of these types of things, if you ever want to just about roll your eyes so far back in your head you don't know if they'll ever come back, listen to the pundits after something like this happens, especially in a political campaign season like it is right now. Goodness, I'm listening to these things and just thinking, how do I say this? The rhetoric that's taking place right now, I don't think for a second the biggest critics believe it for a moment, the things that they're saying. They simply say it because they know there are enough people out there that believe it. And that is incredibly cynical, probably on my part, but certainly on theirs. That you'll say stuff because you know that it's going to sell, and you don't believe it yourself. That is so frustrating. But such is the way of things in modern day. Anyway, what I wanted to kind of do was see if I couldn't just kind of put some things in perspective and kind of explain a little bit about this guy that was taken out, this general, Soleimani, and I'm sure that we've all seen the news on it, but I don't know how much we know about him and how much we know about what he was the head of and what they believe, and a little bit of the demographics of both Iran and Iraq, because it's an important thing that's going on. So I thought I'd kind of pick those pieces a bit and read for you just some of the details about who that guy was, not as much who he was, but to who he was connected, and what was the group that he led, and all that kind of stuff. And it really kind of helps you understand a little bit better about why everything had happened in the last week, and then the things that took place last night. And I guess what made kind of push me over the edge, that I figured sooner or later I was going to want to do this, was the more that I've heard people talking about that the president has begun World War III, it's like, okay, now it's enough. So we'll get into all of that stuff tonight. So let's have a word of prayer, and let's dig into some of these things. Father, we thank you as we're gathered here this evening. We thank you that we can come to you and we can seek answers for the understanding of the things in our world around us today. And Lord, we thank you that we have so much in your word that we can depend upon. And so what we would ask is that you would give us ears to hear not only what your scripture speaks about the days in which we live and the things that are going to come in the future, but most importantly, that we would have our minds settled on this fact, that you love us and that you have seen to our eternity and that you have not left us without answers. We thank you for that. We pray, God, that you would speak through the things that are shared tonight, and that you would give comfort to everyone who's here. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen? Now, the whole thing, interestingly enough, a few days ago, I'm thinking, I was expecting to hear from some of the people going on the trip to Israel, is this going to affect the trip? And before anything else happened, I didn't think it would. It's a long ways away, and though there is all the saber rattling about Israel, they've been doing that nonsense for a very long time. That's the default, okay? As soon as something happens that they don't like, you'll get them out in the street, they'll scream and yell, they'll chant death to America and death to Israel, and everybody's going to get themselves all worked up, and then it's going to go back to normal. But the thing that's interesting about this particular guy and what started, really, you would think from listening to everything that's going on, as of, like, say, last Thursday morning, everything was just hunky-dory in that part of the world, and Iran just wanted to be our friend until we took out one of their generals, and now they're mad at us. Now, that's the kind of nonsense that you'll get from the news, and none of it's true. In fact, if you want to try to find out when this really all started, think the revolution in '79. And Iran has been at war with the world ever since that. So they have their groups that they send into the surrounding countries, but whenever you hear about, sleeper cells and everything else, all of that stuff would be probably done, and at least, unless they're just rogue people, all of that stuff was going to come through the Al-Quds force. And the Al-Quds force was headed by this Soleimani guy. So you got to kind of figure out who's who in this, and I'll read a bit of that to you, for you rather, and give you a bit of an understanding on things. Now, one other part that I want to make sure that we mention here, when we get to the prophetic things of especially Ezekiel, you're going to find that the war that we know that really does come soon is one of the main participants is Persia. And so there are people that still to this day cannot really settle their minds on if Gog is Russia, and let them go ahead and argue about that. What we do know is one of the major participants in this war is Persia. So when you look through Ezekiel 38 and Ezekiel 39, you're going to find Persia has a major role in this. And so when Ezekiel was talking about those things, he was talking about what we would consider as just more geographical areas, because the nations were not carved up in nice, neat, tidy little borders. They were just geographical areas. So Persia we would understand as Iran. And we know Iran takes a particular interest in Israel. So again, when I hear World War, and you read what's happening, the next thing that happens in the Middle East, I believe you're going to find is really kind of more of the Ezekiel kind of scenario. And it's not a world war, it's regional. And you'll see who's involved in it, but ultimately it's something else that's not told to us, but while they're there, then they do come after Israel. And what they do, the rest of the countries that if it was going to be a world war, instead of engaging, they're instead asking questions kind of from the sidelines, saying, why are you doing what you're doing to this coalition that comes against Israel? Israel's the focus in this. So Ezekiel 38, the word of the Lord came, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Behold, I am coming against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, turning you around, and then it's the hooks in the jaw, and it's that God draws them into a conflict. Now, some people would have thought, well, maybe we are going to start with the whole conflict by the things that we did by taking out the general. Well, I don't think you got to really worry much about that. But by the time you get to verse 5, the first of the coalition that's mentioned it's Persia in verse 5. So you would look at this and say, of the people that are mentioned here, there has never been this coalition of nations of the ones that we can certainly identify. They've never come against Israel in the way that this is written. So this is still future. So when you start to see intrigues like this happen in that part of the world, well, okay, pay attention to it. It's interesting. But when you see the participants, and I believe that they're all kind of there, but Israel's not the prize, and there's nothing that brings them into a conflict. So again, when you start hearing people talk about World War III, the idea of committing troops to that part of the world, nobody is interested in doing that. Certainly not the president, and it's not a war that you would necessarily want to fight with people on the ground. That makes no sense. So frankly, what I was expecting after last night, if it turned out that what Iran had done was really inflict some kind of really serious damage, my guess is that by this time today, we would have already started taking out nuclear sites. We'd be taking out all kinds of military sites, lots of infrastructure, power. We would probably cripple an already horribly crippled country and probably put them back years just trying to make ends meet. This is a country that's really not in very good shape. And so the idea of some kind of a war, what you need in order for that to happen, you've got to have alliances on either side if it's a world war. Who's going to line up with that group and who's going to line up with that group, and what's the objective and what are you fighting over? In this case, the things of the Quds Force and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard and the imams and the Ayatollah in particular, really there's nothing that's a, quote, cause for them outside of their Islamic desire to turn the Middle East into their version of Islam. So I wanted to get into all of that kind of stuff tonight. And so how many of you are familiar with when you start to talk about what's a Sunni and what's a Shiite? Okay, a few of you? Okay. So we know there's two main factions. There's the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Shiites are very much the minority in the rest of around the world. But in Iran, the numbers that, do I have them here? Yeah. When it comes to that, in Iraq, Shias account for 65% of the population. In Iran, it is 90%. Now, they are probably less than 20% of the world's population of Muslims. But in those two countries, they are the majority. And in Iran, they are really militant. And so when you start to find out who's who and what they believe, how many of you are familiar with a term called the 12s? The 12s? A couple of you, a few of you. These are the people, you've probably heard of people talking about their 12th imam that they're awaiting, the Mahdi. How many of you have heard those terms? Okay. This general was a 12er, as is most of Shia Islam. And so whether it's the Ayatollah and the people under him and all of the leadership and all of those guys in Iran, most Shias are some form of what we would call 12er. So I'm going to read for you what all of that means and really what is the motivation to it. So behind the scenes in this, let's remember that the problems that were taking place in Iraq are not recent. So how many of you guys remember a guy named Muqtada al-Sadr from the days of the war? Okay. If not, you can look him up. It was just the first thing that I thought because, again, listening to our media, everything was just great, man. It was Mayberry until somebody decided to take out this guy close to the airport. And look at what our president has done. The world was all at peace, and now it's a problem. Well, when you look at a guy named Muqtada al-Sadr, he was a Shiite. And so if you know Sadr City, that's because he's from Sadr City. And so he was a Shiite cleric, and he was the guy that was creating all kinds of problems in that area. Though Saddam Hussein was Sunni. Does everybody remember that? He was not Shiite. So he's in the minority as far as his sect of Islam, but he was a dictator. So when the time came to remove him, Iran wasn't upset about that at all, but the problem is that it was us who was also there. So they're really divided. They want to get their hands on it. They want to run Iraq. I mean, wouldn't you like to take over a country? Now, if you notice, their parliament there in Iraq wanted to vote to get us out, or asked to demand to get us out. Their parliament is now majority Shia. And so you would expect, because of that, they want them all out. So there's a lot of political intrigue that's happening in that part of the world right now anyway. Well, with all that said, what has happened over the last months, let's just even say the last year, if you think about how many times not only our ships, but other ships have been attacked or charged in the Persian Gulf, some have been boarded. Just since, now before it was Trump, it was in the last administration, they actually took some of our guys captive. Remember all the video that we watched of all that? The belligerence has been going on for years. The question is, would it continue on as it has without an answer? And so we all know kind of the answer to that. Now, we had drones that were shot down. That was also taking place. And then in the last couple of weeks, it really started to ramp up. Now, let's remember this general was supposed to be confined to the nation of Iran. But he was going anywhere, anytime. He wasn't caring about what the UN had to say or anyone else. He just kind of was able to operate with impunity. And then a few weeks back, 2 or 3 weeks back, there were the attacks on some of our bases in Iran, or in Iraq rather, and it was pretty clear that this guy had a hand in it. Actually, any of that kind of stuff going on there, his fingerprints would have been all over it. The problem was he was around. And so it would give the impression that he was in charge of the whole thing. Now, this whole time, we haven't done much in the way of retaliation. and then they went after our embassy. And that was very reminiscent of 79, if you remember all of that. And that's when everything ramped up. We started sending, people there, and we started to really work through those things. And again, this guy is all over it. His name was actually scrolled on one of the walls. So when you see it burning, you'll see the name, and I think it was for the Quds Force and all that stuff. And it was celebrating that he had probably been the mastermind of it. Nothing would have happened without him knowing. And then we got actionable intelligence that we knew where he was. Now, let's remember that under the Obama administration, the Quds Force was considered a terrorist organization. So this is not some diplomat hanging out in Iraq on some diplomatic mission. This is the head of what is a terrorist organization, according to our own State Department, and we've got the head of it who probably he certainly oversaw and would have given the orders for the sieging of our embassy. And we know where he is, and he's in a car away from civilians, and we took him. That's what happened. So people would want to argue about that, fight over it. Just it is what it is. Go look through the timeline, and I will read for you a bit about who the Quds Force is. And all of what I just said is very easy to track down. Now, as I'm about to read this, I want to stipulate that Wikipedia is not always the most reliable of sources. Okay? But what they do, what you can find is that it's pretty easy to track down whether or not the information is incorrect by the sources that are there. And they do, if what they have there is accurate, it's usually very easily put together and easy to read through. So the stuff that I'm going to read for you is stuff that I've known and stuff that I've heard spoken of, and I don't think it's really much in dispute, though you can check all of this for yourself if you like, because I'm not going to get into a lot of real heavy specifics in this. But how many of you know that when it comes to Islam, the difference between the Shia and the Sunni, in that part of the world, again, like I said, the Shiites only account for less than 20% of all of the Muslims on the planet. But they're very much radicalized. And so the entire administration in Iran is Shiite and has been since the revolution. These are also people who believe that they are just waiting for the revealing of their 12th imam. Their 12th imam, is really a messianic figure. And when I read some of the stuff for you about that and how they think that he's going to be working kind of hand in hand with Jesus, they have a really interesting eschatology, and you could tell that it has been heavily taken from Scripture. They just put their own names on it and try to claim it as their own. But it's pretty interesting. Now, the split, and this is really kind of an interesting thing. And I realize half of what I'm saying tonight would get me killed in a lot of the world. But at the beginning of Islam, you have Muhammad. Muhammad dies, and then there's kind of a power vacuum. And you have two camps that are going to fight over this. Now, Muhammad had one of his daughters, Fatima, and she had a husband, and his name was Ali. So the son-in-law of Muhammad was supposed to lead, but there was another guy named Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr had the guns and the people, so he won. That would be the Sunnis, and the Shiites are the ones who would follow Ali. And so that's the fight that's been going on for, more than a millennia. Interesting little side note, it is really reminiscent of exactly what happened in Mormonism. When Joseph Smith died, it was supposed to be his kid. It was Junior. Joseph Smith Jr. was supposed to lead him. But there was that Brigham Young guy who had all the guns and the people. He won. It's really interesting how the similarities are there. And a whole lot of other ones as well. So with all that said, we get the rocket attacks, and then this general is taken out, and then the question is, what is the retaliation going to be? If you guys have been paying attention much to it, how many of you were just waiting to hear what happened when the rockets started flying last night? There were missiles. There were ballistic missiles, more than likely. Everybody knows how a ballistic missile works? Okay. Ballistic missile, when they say ballistic missile, it's fired, and there's some guidance at the beginning of it, but it's supposed to kind of drop down on its target. whereas like a cruise missile or something like that flies a bit lower and is more direct and it's guided right to where it's supposed to be. The ones that they went after, the installations that they went after, were pretty hardened. So a lot of people were thinking, and especially because some of them just fell out in a field and they never made it to their destination, there are two schools of thought in this. One is that they needed the propaganda back home. And I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but there was all the speculation of just how many people they would say that they killed of us in our places. You know, I haven't seen the media there from Iran yet, but we're expecting that they're going to say that they did some devastating attack on our interests in Iraq, and hundreds, if not thousands, of our men died, and so it was a great victory for Allah and rah-rah. So my guess is that will come along sooner or later. If that was the objective, knowing that if they did kill more, that it would really kind of just, then it would start to escalate. Again, putting boots on the ground, I don't think that's ever going to happen in Iran. I don't see it. I just see us doing it from afar and crippling them. That will probably be what ends up happening, if it even goes any further. If you guys have watched all the things taking place today, everybody seems to be taking a breath right now, because Iran's able to say, we retaliated, not very effectively. I don't think there were even any injuries. They put a few holes in the ground, and so again, they can claim victory. If that's all that there is, great. But last night when that was going on, I was thinking, I wonder how many more rounds of this there will be, and it just depends on how much damage there was that was done. So as it goes right now, if it turns out that it is what it is, and there's been this discussion that there were back channels that were happening and that there were diplomats talking to one another, and basically it was this, us saying, hey, look, your general was a really bad guy, and he stuck his head out of a hole long enough and we removed it. Now, the next guy that takes his place, frankly, I would not want to be that guy. However, that's the next guy in line. And I would guess that we would have said, if you guys don't knock off the things that you're doing, he's next. And you can keep sending him out there and we'll keep taking him. That would be my guess. They would have also been able to say, okay, if you're going to fire the rockets, if nobody dies in this thing, you guys can go ahead and claim your victory and leave it at that, or else. Now, a couple more rockets happened, but they were from within. They're probably Katyushas or something like that. They were from within Iraq. That happened a little bit earlier, and it's just the same old nonsense that happens, kind of the same thing that goes on in Gaza all the time, that Hamas is throwing stuff out of Gaza. So, with that said, this Qasem Soleimani, this general, is part of he is the head of the Quds force. When you hear Quds force, Quds is a reference to Jerusalem. Okay, so just know that. That is, of course, they've really branched off to what all that is. These guys have been around since the Iran-Iraq war. And, of course, the goal is to rid that part of the world of Jews. And now that there are, quote, Christians or infidels or us, then, of course, they want us out of there as well. But here's the Quds Force. I just want to read some details about them. The Quds Force is a unit in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps specializing in unconventional warfare and military intelligence operations. U.S. Army Iraq War General Stanley McChrystal described the Quds Force as an organization roughly analogous to a combination of the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command, or what they call JSOC, in the United States. And this is what they're responsible for. They're responsible for extraterritorial operations. The Quds Force supports non-state actors in many countries, including Lebanese Hezbollah. Responsible for extraterritorial operations. The Quds Force supports non-state actors in many countries, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. There are also, how many of you have heard of the Yemeni, the Houthis? Okay, again, Shiite militias. The Houthis and Iraq's and Syria's and Afghanistan's Shia militias. So this guy would have been overseeing any subversive fight against the government kind of people in those those countries where they're looking for throwing off Sunni rule and being subversive as Shiites in those areas. Now, here's the interesting thing. What you'll notice about the two factions within Islam, they have a full-time occupation of killing one another. And the only time that you get them to agree on not killing one another is if they can get one of us, or if they can come after Israel. That's when they're okay with each other. Aside from that, not much, as far as the militants are concerned. The Quds is considered a terrorist organization by Canada, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United States. Analysts estimate that the Quds force has maybe from 10 to as many as 20,000 members, and the Quds force reports directly to Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini. So when it comes to this general, he answered to one guy, and even the reports that you're hearing, they'll flat out tell you that. I'm hearing him. You have President Rouhani, and he's the guy that's making a bunch of noise all the time, and you'll see him at the. He's the guy that took over for Ahmadinejad, I believe. I think it was from him to him. Everybody remember that guy? Okay, a 12er, interesting character. I've heard a lot of great names for him. Really, really good names for him. But anyways, a play on his name. I don't have time for this. Rouhani is a figurehead more than anything else. He's the political guy. But when it comes to the Ayatollah, that's the supreme leader. And there was one guy that was closer to him and had more power than anybody else, and that was the Soleimani guy that got taken out last week. That's how big of a deal it is. If you want to try to get the equivalent in our world, in the way that we think about it, you really got to go back to more like World War II to find somebody that obvious. Maybe in the Gulf War when we were thinking about Schwarzkopf. But this is like taking out the equivalent to us of a Patton or an Eisenhower. It's that big of a deal. Okay, so that's what has just taken place. Now, that guy's gone. And so the Quds Force was created during the Iran-Iraq War as a special unit from the broader IRGC forces, and it has the mission of liberating supposed Muslim land. There is your issue. Now, that is why there is so much activity that they have in that whole part of the world. Why do you have groups like Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and Hamas and all of those why do you have them? Because Israel's in the land, and that is their land as they see it. In fact, depending on how militant it is, if a Muslim has stepped foot in an area, it is Islamic land. So liberating supposed Muslim land, especially Al-Quds, which takes its name as the Jerusalem Force. So the whole stated purpose is to rid the land of non-Muslims and take it back and claim it for Islam. Both during and after the war, it provided support to the Kurds fighting Saddam Hussein. Now, isn't that interesting? Because they can't stand the Kurds. But the Kurds, the enemy, the old saying about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yeah, they hated Hussein. Why? He's a Sunni and a secularist and a really vile guy. And hedonistic. And his sons were even more messed up than he was. So they see him as not only a Sunni, but as an infidel within Islam. And they wanted him done. Besides, they got the numbers in the country. And he was suppressing their people. So the Kurds looked like a good group of people who didn't like him either, so support those guys. In 1982, the Quds unit was deployed to Lebanon, where it assisted in the genesis of Hezbollah. So if you know it in Israel, if you're looking at it here in the Mediterranean's on this side, and here's Israel top to bottom. Down here in the bottom is the Gaza Strip, right up against Egypt. That's where you see Hamas. Hezbollah is up in the north in Lebanon, and it operates all throughout the country. It's taken that from what was really they called it the Riviera of the Mediterranean and turned it into just a rat's nest. Again, but it's what Islam does. Now, according to General McChrystal, it was the Quds force that flooded Iraq with explosive-formed projectiles, IEDs. We've heard about all of those. When you've heard people saying that this general had been responsible for the killing of hundreds of our people and the wounding of thousands, mainly it's through the roadside bombs, but the ones that they really perfected that were able to get through armor, that is really credited to this guy and the people that worked directly for him. They would fire molten copper slugs that were able to penetrate armor, and it accounted for nearly 20% of American combat deaths in Iraq. And in September 2007, a few years after the publication of this book, it was in July of 2006 that General Petraeus reported to Congress that the Quds Force had left Iraq. Now, this is how they'll get out when the heat's too much, but don't think that they've left. Notice the years on this. 2006, Petraeus reports to Congress that the Al-Quds Force had left. Petraeus said the Al-Quds Force itself, we believe, by and large, those individuals have been pulled out of the country, as have the Lebanese Hezbollah trainers that were being used to augment that activity. But by July of 2008, Seymour Hersh wrote in the New Yorker that President Bush had signed a presidential finding authorizing the CIA and Joint Special Operations to conduct cross-border parliamentary operations from Iraq and Afghanistan into Iran. And these operations were to be against the Al-Quds Force and high-value targets. So it has been since 2008, at this point, they're talking about we've got to find out. Now, they may have pulled back. They're still supporting the people that are in the country, but they're doing it using the people in Iraq more as proxies rather than having their Al-Quds people there. They make the friendships and everything else, and then they support them in any way possible. That's the line that was getting IEDs in there and all that kind of stuff. Okay, are you with me so far? So it says the finding was focused on undermining Iran's nuclear ambitions and trying to undermine the government through regime change. A person familiar with its contents said, and involved working with opposition groups. That really was doing quite well until last administration, when you had people that were ready to overthrow the imams. They were ready to do it from within, and we backed out of it. We left them, and just even the people that are protesting. Did you guys know that like within the last couple of weeks there was protest and the Iranian government took out like 1,600 people, just massacred them in the street? That was done at the word of Soleimani. That's that guy, okay? So dissidents go into the street, get enough of them there, take them out. Just mowed them down. But that happens all the time. This is why it's just hilarious when I'm watching all the people talking. And, of course, we had I guess it was the Golden Globes, and some of the people were talking about, what a horrible guy our president is, and, for assassinating a foreign dignitary and all the rest of that. It's like, you know what, you morons, you ought to just go take a holiday there in Iran. They will throw you off of a building for what you are and for who you are and what you do. It's just a little added something there. In October of 2011, the Obama administration revealed that the United States government alleged that the Al-Quds Force was involved in a plot to assassinate Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States, which also entailed plans to bomb the Israeli and Saudi embassies located in Washington. Probably didn't hear about that. But this is the kind of intelligence. I remember hearing President Bush years ago say, there will be a lot of things that you'll see in the news, and there will be a lot of things that you'll never hear about. And so, that's a loose translation of what he said. In Iraq, it says the force operated throughout Iraq, arming, aiding, and abetting Shiite militias, i.e. the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution, Dawa, and the Mahdi Army. And some of you have probably heard those names if you pay much attention to the things happening there. And it said that it had close ties to Iran, some dating back decades as part of the struggle against Saddam Hussein and his whole regime. Again, Shiite versus Sunni. But see, remember, they fought a war back in the 80s. Now, as I'm putting all this stuff together and looking through it, I'm thinking, man, I wish Elijah was here. I'd like to have him come and do this and be a part of this. But knowing Elijah, we'd be here for days. But he's got so much really good information on this because he was conscripted basically to be involved in that war as God got him out miraculously. He was about ready to get involved in that war. So let's remember a few things. From the time that, quote, hostilities ended formally between Iran and Iraq, there was always the subversive groups trying to undermine Hussein, but he had a real stranglehold on the country, right? We all know that. He didn't have the numbers, but he had the right people in place, and he would crush any rebellion. And so now they see, with him gone, they see their opportunity. And if you have been paying attention, and if you haven't been paying attention, start looking into this. But from the time that Saddam Hussein was gone, look at how much Iran's influence in the country of Iraq has grown. It's grown exponentially, okay? They're not just a minor factor barking from next door. They are full-blown involved, and they're undermining and actually beginning to take a lot of power in the country. Now, against the Islamic State, here's one of those places, just interesting. In 2014, the Quds Force was deployed into Iraq to lead Iranian actions against ISIS. And Iran sent 3 Quds Force battalions to help the Iraqi government repel ISIS in the northern Iraqi offensive. Over 40 officers participated in the Second Battle of Tikrit, including the leader of the force, Soleimani. He was involved in that whole thing. Now, here's what's so interesting about that. Why would they want ISIS gone? There are a bunch of other terrorists. Can we just make sure that, let me repeat on this, Al-Quds is referred to as a terrorist organization by our country. We're agreed on that? And if we're agreed on that, then remember that the head of that organization would be the lead terrorist. That's the guy that we just took out. Are we clear on all that? This very same guy was involved in trying to get rid of ISIS. Does anybody have any idea why the Quds Force and Iran would want to get rid of ISIS? They're Sunnis. And they wanted to, create a caliphate, which would be basically setting up they're thinking back to the days of Muhammad, to have just absolute control over a whole area. And they were incredibly radical. So we all know what happened to, al-Baghdadi. He had a bad day, kind of like Soleimani. And this idea of them being a terrorist organization, the United States Department of Treasury designated Al-Quds Force under executive order for providing material support to U.S. designated terrorist organizations. And so on October 2007, prohibiting transactions between the group and U.S. citizens and freezing assets under the U.S. jurisdiction, the government of Canada designated Al-Quds Force as a terrorist organization in 2012, and then other ones joined in because of what Iran was doing down in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Do you remember when a bunch of things were attacked and the oil fields were attacked in Saudi Arabia? That was happening by Iran and their proxies down in Yemen. Okay, if you remember all that stuff. So you're wondering, who is giving them? Again, this is a country that doesn't have any money. But we managed to give them a whole lot of it. If you remember, right in the closing days of the last administration, they would say that it was money that was owed to them because it was frozen. Well, that was for arms and everything else. We gave the money back, but we also gave them interest to the tune of about $150 billion. And you wonder how much of that money made its way into those rockets last night, but no one will ever know. Now, 12ers. This is a belief. Let me see. I think it's in here. If not, I'll do it. Okay, a 12er. I just realized back to my old days before the Lord, that's what we used to just call a big thing of beer. 12er. It's a term I haven't used in 35 years or somewhere thereabouts. Oh, you can get it in soda, so it's okay. 12-pack of soda. It's a 12er. 12er. I have to go get it from my wife from time to time with Diet Coke. I don't have time for this. Okay. It is known as the largest branch within Shia Islam. The term 12er refers to its adherents' belief in the 12 divinely ordained leaders known as the 12 imams. And an imam is just a high-ranking leader within Islam. That's what an imam is. So their belief that the last imam, or Imam al-Mahdi, lives in what is known as occultation. And occultation is very simply this. It means a time of hiding. And so the Mahdi that they're talking about had one time when he was